This idyllic spot in the mountains of western Pennsylvania was the perfect place for a private resort. In the late 19th century, wealthy families from Pittsburgh decided to buy the property to build summer homes around the magnificent man-made lake created by the giant South Fork Dam. The dam was old and uncared for, but it held back the lake the sporty fishermen loved so well. Downstream in the city of Johnstown, 15-year-old Victor Heiser watched the rich vacationers pass by on their way to the resort. Neither he nor his neighbors had ever been invited to join. When it started raining on Memorial Day in 1889, the city quickly became inundated with water. This happened all the time, so no one became alarmed. But at 3:15 the following day, the old dam collapsed.
Water began to pour over the top of the entire structure, and it eroded it away. So that when the dam overtopped, this huge amount of water rushed down at high volume.
20 million gallons of water hit an unsuspecting Johnstown with the force of a tidal wave. Victor Heiser saw his house and his family clinging for dear life ripped from its foundations. For years afterward, he was visited by nightmares. He saw himself swirling and choking and racing past trees and debris and the bodies of his neighbors, struggling for life or already dead. The 37-foot-high wave destroyed the city in 10 minutes. Victor Heiser somehow survived, but 2,200 others did not, making the death toll here larger than the San Francisco earthquake and the Chicago fire combined. The irony of the Johnstown flood was that it began with a dam. Throughout history, dams have been built to prevent flooding, and for the most part, they've done this safely and very well. Big dams also irrigate fields, capture drinking water, and generate electricity. But they also alter the course of rivers, damage fish populations, and submerge natural valleys.
I would say that next to nuclear power, dams are the biggest Faustian bargain that mankind has struck with nature.
With the exception of the Great Wall of China, dams are the largest structures ever built. Dams, coming next on Building Big.
Major funding for Building Big is provided by the National Science Foundation. America's investment in the future. Funding is also provided by
You'd be surprised how much of our technology goes into your day. We're Siemens.
the American Society of Civil Engineers, working to build you a better world since 1852. The National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding our understanding of the world. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is Iguaçu Falls, located half in Brazil and half in Argentina. Truly one of the great natural wonders of the world. And in this magical setting, we see the ability of water to sustain and nourish the lushness of life. But what we can hear is the sound of raw, uncontrolled power.
To use this massive power, engineers have to control it, which requires them to build the mightiest structures ever conceived. Whatever their size or shape, virtually all big dams hold back flowing water and create a lake. They let some of the water through to keep the river flowing, but they can also severely affect the ecology of river life. Yet what we gain from dams, a ready supply of water and hydroelectric power, have made them indispensable to the growth and support of large populations, especially cities. Without dams, modern life as we know it would simply not be the same. Our understanding of how to use dams to preserve the life-sustaining gifts of water is not a recent phenomenon. In fact, their development parallels the growth of ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Ironically, one of the first attempts to build a very large dam would occur in the middle of the bone-dry Egyptian desert, miles from any water. Here, any source of water is as valuable as gold. But even the driest desert will get some rain, and on rare occasions it will rain hard. When this happens, the sun-baked land can't absorb the sudden deluge. Streams form and merge, becoming a dangerous flash flood, capable of destroying everything in its path. Though frightening, to let so much water simply wash away seemed a terrible waste to the ancient Egyptians. So, about 5,000 years ago, workers came to an arid valley south of Cairo where flash floods were known to occur and built an unusual stone structure with a stepped face. The ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Ironically, one of the first attempts to build a very large dam would occur in the middle of the bone-dry Egyptian desert, miles from any water. Here, any source of water is as valuable as gold. But even the driest desert will get some rain, and on rare occasions it will rain hard. When this happens, the sun-baked land can't absorb the sudden deluge. Streams form and merge, becoming a dangerous flash flood, capable of destroying everything in its path. Though frightening, to let so much water simply wash away seemed a terrible waste to the ancient Egyptians. So, about 5,000 years ago, workers came to an arid valley south of Cairo where flash floods were known to occur and built an unusual stone structure with a stepped face, the world's first attempt at a big dam.
Since there were once important stone quarries near here, as well as villages for the workers and their families, engineers built this massive dam called Sad el Khafra to protect the people here, as well as those living much farther down the valley. That weathered pile of stone is all that remains of a dam which once looked something like this. It was huge, 300 feet thick at the base and almost 70 feet high.
I had seen it myself, not knowing what it was. When I was a college student, I had not known then that it was 4,700 years old, almost exactly the time of the building of the very first pyramid.
In fact, the dam was designed like a pyramid, and for good reason. First of all, its great size and wide base gave it enough weight and stability to withstand the force of a raging flood without being pushed backward. And by slanting the face like a pyramid, the builders directed the force of the water down to the dam's bulky center. A lighter structure with a straight wall could have broken apart or toppled over. Now, once any dam halts the flow of water, a lake will form behind it, which is exactly what the thirsty desert dwellers wanted. What they didn't want was water seeping all the way through, because this would have eroded the rock and destroyed the dam. So the builders let the water penetrate the outer stones, but stopped it in its tracks with a zone of dense, waterproof clay. This basic design, a waterproof clay core between walls of rock and rubble, is still being used today, despite the fate that befell Sad el Khafra.
Now there's a reason why the middle of the dam is gone. Our best guess is that sometime before it was completed, the rains came a lot heavier than expected. The dam stopped the initial flood, but the lake soon overtopped it.
This is just about the worst thing that can happen to a dam. As the water flowed over the top, it scoured out the clay core and then broke through, releasing a lake full of water, just like Johnstown.
The reason that the Sad el Khafra may have been one of these unusual floods. So every 1,000 years or every 2,000 years, there is an enormous deluge that just takes everything in its way.
It was a disaster. They never tried any other dam in Egypt's history until the 19th century. In fact, you know, it took another 4,500 years for people to build another dam.
Over the centuries, other cultures would learn how to build dams, to save water and to irrigate crops, to feed growing populations. But Egypt found it could feed its population without dams. For it had a remarkable river capable of irrigating the desert all on its own. Not only is the Nile one of the mightiest rivers in the world, each spring it would slowly rise with the rains that swelled its headwaters in Central Africa. By May, the river would overflow its banks and flood a wide ribbon of desert. This annual flood filled wells with drinking water and deposited a nutrient-rich silt on the desert floor. The wet silt made Egypt's dry land fertile, helping to create one of the longest-lasting civilizations the world has ever known.
We really loved the muddy waters of the Nile. The Nile renewed our land. It put new layers of silt over it every year. We did not have to use fertilizer. The silt was our fertilizer. So whatever we planted grew.
But there were some years when the river didn't rise at all, causing widespread drought and famine. Other times the Nile flooded too much, inundating fields and villages.
I remember in 1959, the water was very high, and we'd walk through these towns, and you'd see that the whole population is sitting it out, absolutely still. You'd see that the men of these villages would find a place that is high and dry, and they just sit there. And when you pass by and greet them, they just murmur. Even returning the greeting is an effort. It's hot, and there's nothing, and they just sit it out.
So after centuries of living with the vagaries of the remarkable river, Egypt finally grew weary of its unpredictable gift. But only a massive dam could completely control the flooding of the Nile. By the 20th century, engineers had learned how to design very big dams that could store water and produce something as valuable to the modern world as water was to the ancient world. electricity. The British had built a dam on the Nile that by the 1920s was producing electricity. But the Aswan Low Dam, as it was called, was never big enough to fully control the annual flooding. So in 1952, when Egypt elected Gamal Abdel Nasser as its new president, the charismatic leader pledged to modernize his country and to begin the process with a giant new dam on the Nile. It was the early years of the Cold War.
In Washington, President Eisenhower and Britain's Prime Minister,
Nasser knew that the United States and Britain wanted Egypt as a Middle Eastern ally and would eagerly finance his expensive Aswan High Dam. But he also wanted to buy arms for Egypt's continuing struggle with Israel. When America refused the request, Nasser bought them from Czechoslovakia.
This really wasn't Czechoslovakia, it was Moscow. The total coming to a couple of $100 million worth of arms, which was a lot of money in the middle 1950s. Dwight Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles were shocked, dismayed, and angry at what Egypt had done.
The United States has every...
Britain and the United States withdrew their pledge to help in the financing of the Aswan High Dam and essentially said, it's dead, it's gone, forget it.
And so the Americans said, no, you can't buy arms from the Eastern Bloc. And Nasser said, well, we can buy arms with our money from anywhere we want to.
Egyptian commentators
And it is said that on the following morning, the Soviet ambassador was in Nasser's office to tell him that we're ready to do this and we'll give you easy terms and you don't have to pay us with hard currency. You can pay us with cotton and products and we will do it for you.
By standing up to the Western powers, Nasser and his new revolutionary government had become heroes.
And now they wanted to do something super fantastic for Egypt. Because at the time, Nasser had a slogan, we're going to industrialize and we're going to build from the needle to the rocket. So with that much industrialization, you need a lot of power, electric power.
On January 9th, 1960, Nasser and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev symbolically threw the first rocks into the Nile to begin construction. The Aswan High Dam would be the biggest dam ever, 17 times larger than the Great Pyramid, and designed to last just as long. The first thing the new partners had to do was divert the Nile. Since you cannot build a dam in flowing water, the men blasted a temporary channel out of the desert and then blocked the river with a crude rock barrier called a cofferdam. When the river hit the cofferdam, it was forced into the diversion channel, which carried the water around the dam site and dumped it back into the river far downstream. A second cofferdam prevented the water from flowing backward and kept the construction area completely dry. The diversion channel worked beautifully, but soon the optimism that greeted the project began to fade. The desert heat was brutal on the men. Transportation was difficult. Communications between Russians and Egyptians were confusing. Each blamed the other for delays. The Russians complained there were not enough trained Egyptians. The Egyptians complained that Russian equipment was always breaking down.
Soviet equipment is built for cold climates, and it experienced a lot of difficulty operating in the wind, sand, dust, and an extraordinary heat of Aswan.
At the height of construction, there were over 30,000 men working on the dam. In such harsh, confusing, and crowded conditions, 500 workers would lose their lives, making the death toll at Aswan one of the highest ever recorded. The biggest problem the builders had to overcome was the Nile's ancient riverbed. It contained hundreds of feet of silty sand and gravel, and the engineers couldn't anchor the dam on such soft ground. But clearing all the silt would have taken years, unless engineers could come up with another solution. Today, you can drive over the Aswan Dam, but it's difficult to tell what it actually looks like. Lake Nasser now covers most of the dam, which is really a 600-foot-high mountain of stone and sand. The peak, which you can see, is covered with concrete. And the base, which you cannot, is nearly a mile wide and is the key to the dam's stability.
When engineers want to block an enormous river like the Nile, they generally build an embankment dam. It can be made of earth and stone or a combination, and have a very wide base and sloping walls. The wide base, here at Aswan it stretches almost 3/4 of a mile, gives the dam stability against the river's thrust and weight. The sloping wall helps divert the water pressure away from the narrow top down towards the meaty center. Now, water can seep through this. But hidden inside this mountain of sand and stone is the true barrier to the river's flow, a solid core of impervious clay. Builders generally want the dam, or at least the core, to rest on bedrock. Here, that bedrock is under 600 feet of silt and loose rock. Trying to excavate all that muck and debris for 3/4 of a mile would have taken forever and cost a fortune. So instead, the engineers decided to transform a slice of the riverbed with something called a grout curtain.
The problem with a soft foundation is that water can actually flow through the riverbed, which could ultimately destroy the dam. So the workers drilled narrow holes lined with iron pipes deep into the sediment. Grout, a cement-like mixture, was then pumped into the holes as the pipes were pulled back out. This action forced the grout to spread into the soft riverbed. They repeated this process hundreds of times until a solid pedestal-like grout wall stretched 600 feet from the core to bedrock. Since the grout is waterproof, any water seeping under the dam is blocked from getting through. The lake behind the dam created another kind of problem for the Egyptians. It's enormous, covering over 300 miles of desert. There were once ancient monuments located in the area that would have been submerged forever unless they were moved. With the help of the United Nations, 23 irreplaceable treasures were dismantled stone by stone and carefully transported to safer places. Before they were cut apart, the pieces were numbered so they could be reassembled at their new sites. The hardest monument to move was the 3,000-year-old Abu Simbel, a temple complex devoted to the pharaoh Ramses the Great and his wife Nefertari. It took 4 years to reassemble the magnificent Abu Simbel. "22 other ancient monuments were relocated in the same painstaking way. The beautiful temple of Colapsou was moved 36 miles to a hilltop. Unfortunately, the lake rose higher than expected, and the temple now sits on an island. The caretakers of Colapsou are Nubians. The lake not only submerged ancient monuments, it buried the homes of Nubian villagers whose ancestors had lived along the Nile for thousands of years.
One of the disadvantages of building dams is covering land that used to belong to someone. Like in Egypt, it was the Nubians. The Nubians come from the place called Nub, which is ancient Egyptian mean the land of gold. And these people had their own way of life, their own everything. And everything they had is now inundated by the water from Lake Nasser. And these people had to be resettled. And resettlement of any human being is always a very difficult thing, and it can actually change the culture drastically. And that is what happened in Nubia.
With the new lake about to flood their homelands, 120,000 Nubians had no choice but to leave their ancient villages.
For us, the migration was very hard. It was difficult to leave our homes and to be put on the boats carrying only our belongings and our children, and then to come up here away from the Nile. When we had to leave our homes, we kissed the land. Many of us filled our pockets with soil. After boarding the boat, we just sat in deep silence, staring at our disappearing village.
Over time, the Nubians seem to have adapted to their surroundings. Children who never knew their ancient homelands are now adjusting to a new way of life in the only villages they have ever known.
So when they moved, they were not very comfortable or happy. However, when you look at it, you will find out that they benefited in a way. They had better schools, they had better opportunities for education and for work, employment. However, I cannot defend the fact that you move a man from his place. Yeah, it would be very difficult. If it happens to me, I would be very unhappy too.
Despite their forced removal from the Nile, Nubians have refused to lose their cultural identity. And their sacred river still plays a fundamental role in their art, their customs, and traditions. Though the Aswan Dam would cast a dark shadow on the lives of the Nubian people, for the rest of Egypt, the completion of the dam in 1971 brought nationwide celebrations.
In Egypt, there is a song that said, "قلنا حنبني ودحنا بنينا السد العالي." We said we'll build it, and we did build the high dam, meaning it has actually entered the folklore of Egypt.
Sadly, the man who made it happen was not there for the dedication. Gamal Abdel Nasser had died of a heart attack at the age of 52. The new president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, dedicated the dam and the lake to honor Nasser's name and legacy. And that legacy was immediate and extraordinary. Not only did the Aswan Dam prevent flooding and create electricity, it stored millions of gallons of water that have spared Egypt the devastating bouts of drought and famine that have plagued other African countries bordering the desert.
That saved Egypt. It would store the water of the high flood so that we can use it in years of low flood. If this is the only thing that Egypt had gained from the building of the high dam, it would justify the building of the dam because it made Egypt a livable place.
The high dam at Aswan is more than just a dam on a river. It is a symbol of the ability of the Egyptians to do something fantastic, to save it from floods, to save it from famine, to produce electricity. So it really symbolizes a lot of things.
Egypt is not the only country where a single dam heralded a new age for a growing nation. In the United States, the building of Hoover Dam in the 1930s helped change the face of the American West. This massive dam would transform desert valleys into fields of green, would fuel the unprecedented growth of Western cities, especially Los Angeles. That the fate of Los Angeles could be linked to a structure on the Nevada-Arizona border hundreds of miles away demonstrates the transforming power of big dams. But it also reveals the foresight of those who saw the future reflected in the turbulent waters of the mighty Colorado River. This legendary river wound 1,400 miles through the driest parts of 7 western states. Though the surrounding terrain was too desolate to settle, even for land-hungry Americans, the river was a tantalizing lure, challenging the dreamers who saw its potential. In 1902, industrious farmers cut a channel in the riverbank and diverted a portion of the Colorado into a 100-mile-long irrigation canal. The canal fed California's Imperial Valley, and for 3 years, the Colorado River made the California desert bloom. But eventually, the river struck back, overtopping the canal and flooding the valley. Though the land lay in ruins, the owners had briefly experienced the wealth that might be theirs, if only the wild Colorado could be tamed. But harnessing this river would require big dollars and a very big dam.
During the 3 years that the canal was delivering water there, it became very evident that there was a great deal of money to be made. And there's an old saying in the West that water will flow uphill toward money. And that was really what was happening here.
With Imperial Valley farmers pushing for a reliable water supply, the federal government agreed to help finance the dam if Los Angeles guaranteed to buy the bulk of its electricity when it was finished. The ambitious city could not say yes quick enough.
The Hoover Dam represents a melding between irrigation interest in the Imperial Valley and those interests that want to develop Los Angeles as a urban center. And so they look to Hoover Dam as a new source of supply.
After years of surveying, construction began in 1931 in the narrow gorge called Black Canyon.
The Hoover Dam was one of the greatest dam sites on the planet. They were talking about building a dam much bigger than anything that had ever been built before, much bigger.
The project would require thousands of workers, a consortium of construction firms, and one very able chief engineer. Luckily for the owners, Frank Crowe took the top job.
And he was sort of a Gary Cooper type, tall, taciturn, tough as nails, a driven individual who commanded the total respect of the workers.
Frank Crowe was quite the legend here at Hoover Dam. He was called Hurry Up Crowe because he was always pushing on people to hurry up and get the job done. I think his quote was that there were 8,000 people working in that canyon, and his job was to keep them from killing each other off while they were working.
All dam work is dangerous. But at Hoover, perhaps the riskiest job was performed by high scalers. These men had to smooth and prepare the canyon walls so the sides of the finished dam could rest evenly against the surface.
And they would go down hanging from ropes, sitting on 1 foot by 2 foot wooden seats. They would plant their feet against the canyon wall and push back, and they would take this 44-pound jackhammer and drill holes, blasting holes into the wall of the canyon, and nothing beneath them but 800 feet of empty air.
And you're using a bar to pry at the rocks that you're standing on. You don't really know what's going to come loose. The whole slab of the mountain could come off underneath your feet and take you down with it. So to swing off the edge of that canyon with nothing more than an iron bar and a rope to hang on to was not a job that I would have really been tickled to take.
Like Aswan, Hoover Dam couldn't be built until the river was diverted. But the only way to get the river around the construction site here was to blast tunnels, as big as 4-lane highways right through the canyon walls. Excavating the diversion tunnels was both difficult and dangerous. With all the blasting and heavy equipment, temperatures inside topped 130 degrees. But in truth, there was no relief anywhere.
You know, the boiling heat in the summertime, the freezing in the wintertime, harsh landscape to work in, no water, 130 temperatures during the day, and all of that high-power construction work going on around them. It must have been just almost like an inferno to work in.
During the month of July 1931, 14 workers died of heat stroke, one every 2 days. But the contractors pushed on, working the men day and night. If the dam finished ahead of schedule, there would be bonuses for the supervisors.
They were not kind employers. I remember a high scaler who said, you know, one of his partners fell all the way 300 or 400 feet from his perch to the canyon floor, was obviously stone dead, but they didn't even move him. They just left him lying there, and the trucks just ran right around him. And when he asked his supervisor, why don't they do something with the guy? The supervisor said, well, it's too late for him. He can't be helped, and we got work to do.
This callous attitude was in part driven by the Depression. With so many Americans out of work, the bosses knew these men would do almost anything for steady wages and 3 meals a day.
If anybody didn't feel like working, there was somebody who was going to take his place just like that. I mean, there were people literally waiting for people on the site to die so they could take their jobs.
In 1931, a group of workers went on strike to protest the harsh conditions. The strikers were convinced that Frank Crow, whom they trusted and respected, would back their demands. He didn't. The strike failed, and the leaders were fired. But soon, the most grueling tasks were behind them. And Black Canyon, with its dramatic walls, was finally ready to receive the dam.
One of the first things you notice about the Hoover is just how big it is. This is basically a gravity dam. That is, it's simply heavy enough to resist the weight and the thrust of the water pushing behind it. And you have to remember that there's a giant lake back there that's almost as high as that wall. But this is also a curved dam. And this design was originated to use the properties of the arch to resist the water with a thinner and therefore less expensive dam. Now the arch dam, like the arch, works in compression. The weight of the water pushes against the dam, creating forces that travel all along the curve. But the canyon walls push back, counteracting these forces. This action squeezes or compresses the material of the arch together, making the dam rigid enough so that the lake can't push it over. Now, arch dams have been built successfully throughout the world, but the arch wasn't used here to save money. This dam is so thick and so heavy, it doesn't need to be curved. It was more of a psychological thing. The designers thought that people would feel safer if the dam was curved, and aesthetically, they thought it looked better. And they were right.
Though there was plenty of stone in Black Canyon, the engineers chose to build Hoover out of concrete. Not only is it waterproof, it would enable the builders to create a completely solid wall. But when concrete is poured, it produces a chemical reaction that gives off heat. And the massive quantities required for Hoover presented serious problems.
They used 66 million tons of concrete. The cooling of that mass of concrete was a very daunting problem. Nobody had ever built a dam remotely this size. It would have taken years for that concrete to cool without them having done something to accelerate the cooling process. Not only that, but it'll crack if the cooling is uneven.
There could be no cracks in Hoover Dam. So Frank Crowe built a giant water refrigeration plant right on site. He then had the men set steel pipes inside the wooden forms and pumped chilled water continuously through the pipes so the concrete would cool as it hardened. This method had worked on smaller dams, but would it succeed for the giant Hoover? It did, and soon the great curved wall of Hoover Dam was the largest concrete structure ever built. For finishing the dam ahead of schedule and under budget, Frank Crowe received a $300,000 bonus. Quite a sum back then. But he probably saved his employers millions. On September 30th, 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt inaugurated Hoover Dam, describing it as a symbol of an American spirit, alive and well, even during the hard times of the Depression.
And on behalf of the nation, to say to you, well done.
Soon, Lake Mead would rise and fill Black Canyon almost to the top of the dam. And once this happened, Hoover's giant turbines could finally begin producing electricity.
Most large dams were and still are designed to have the capacity to produce hydroelectric power, and their various components are carefully arranged to control that process. It begins with the level of the lake. It has to be high enough so that the water falls with great velocity into the intake pipes, which lead all the way to the powerhouse on the downstream face of the dam. Here at Hoover, the opening to the intake pipe is right below those deco structures which stick out above the water. Now, the actual making of electricity begins when the water reaches giant turbines near the bottom of the powerhouse.
The rushing water is channeled to the turbine blades, which causes them to spin at a tremendous speed. The spinning turbine rotates a tall shaft, which attaches high above to the generator. Here, a wheel lined with magnets called a rotor spins inside a rim of copper wires. As the magnets spin, they generate an enormous amount of electricity in the copper wires, which is then sent along power lines to the outside world. At Hoover, there are 17 generators producing over 2 million kilowatts of electric energy that is sent to major cities in the Southwest. But the bulk of its power, and a good deal of its water, still goes to Los Angeles, the city that helped make Hoover a reality and was made great in return.
Without Hoover Dam, Los Angeles would be there, but it might be a city of 2 or 3 million people rather than a megalopolis of 14 or 15 million. There'd be no Las Vegas. The American Southwest as we know it simply wouldn't exist but for that dam. It was the first great dam, and it gave us the confidence to build dams of its size elsewhere and on rivers much bigger than the Colorado.
Over the next 3 decades, virtually every major western river was dammed many times over. America would build 6 dams on the Colorado and over 20 on the Columbia River. In 1945, the largest sources of electricity on the planet were the Grand Coulee and Hoover Dams, powering the growth of cities from Seattle to San Diego.
People really believed that this was the future, this was progress. Of course, they weren't looking at other things. They weren't looking at what were the long-term environmental consequences going to be, or what could the impacts be on people living downstream who were going to have their water supply taken away.
The Colorado has been dammed and diverted so many times it no longer reaches the sea. It just trickles out and dies in what is now the Mexican desert. At one time, lush wetlands actually flourished here. Other regions have faced environmental problems as well. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon on the mighty Columbia River are virtually blocked from swimming upstream to lay eggs and renew their species.
The Columbia used to be the most prolific salmon river in the world, bar none. And now, in that basin, 100 separate species of salmon are already extinct, and 200 more are threatened. And the reason is mainly dams, not exclusively. But the salmon just can't get back up to their spawning habitat.
As their negative consequences become clearer, the United States and other industrialized nations have nearly stopped building large dams. Instead, these countries have turned to coal and nuclear power to meet their energy needs. These solutions also present risks to the environment and can often be very expensive. That's why nations like Brazil, with vast river resources, a growing population, and a drive to modernize, continue to build dams.
If we wouldn't have so many dams, we would have to build other kinds of power plants, either coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants. And we think that for a country such as Brazil, hydro is a better solution.
In partnership with neighboring Paraguay, Brazil has already built the largest power-generating dam in the world. The sprawling Itaipu complex produces as much electricity as 12 nuclear power plants. Yet the country needs even more. But when the government announced it was building 2 new dams near the town of Ita in southern Brazil, instead of relief, there were protests from the people who were about to see their homes and livelihoods submerged by the dams.
We had a different language. We as engineers, we were not used to talk to farmers and hearing what they would like to say and incorporating their demands in the way we would be implementing this dam.
Forced to delay construction for 8 years, the government finally gave the protesters just compensation for their land, as well as a brand new town. And the Ita engineers finally got to build their dam. They began by creating a giant-scale model of the entire valley, so they could test the dam from turbines to spillways. If you ever see water flowing through the spillways at the top of a dam, it usually means the lake has risen dangerously high. The excess water needs to be released or the dam could be breached. Spillways are like the overflow drain in a bathtub. But engineers need to know exactly how high and wide they must be to prevent flooding, or worse. It was a blocked spillway that was in part responsible for the 1889 Johnstown disaster.
The whole safety of the complex depends on the proper performance of the spillway.
After 3 years of construction, Ita Dam is nearing completion. At this stage, everything at the dam site has become enormous. The spillways alone are as high as a 40-story skyscraper. To build a dam like Ita requires thousands of workers, food and housing to sustain them, and an enormous payroll to distribute every 2 weeks. Contractors will go through millions of dollars worth of heavy equipment building this dam. The tire bill alone will approach 7 figures. the massive outlay of resources, everyone looks for ways to save money. Here they're using the free rock they've had to excavate from the diversion tunnels to build the body of the dam. And they are making Etah waterproof in the most cost-effective way possible.
This is certainly the last part of the dam you'd expect to see, unless you were a scuba diver. Now, if this reservoir was full, I would be standing under 370 feet of water. Etah looks like a concrete dam, but it's not. What you see is actually a concrete face. Underneath it is a mound of rock that's been tightly compacted together. And even though the concrete face is thin, therefore a lot less expensive than Hoover, it's still watertight.
Here, the men simply pour a thin layer of concrete over a reinforcing steel mesh. And this layering will keep the dam waterproof. These concrete-faced dams are so cost-effective, the design is used wherever possible. But despite the construction savings, Etah will still cost $1 billion, well over its original budget. This is mainly due to the government's failure to take into account the true human costs of building big dams, especially resettlement. The new lake will soon bury old Etah City, which was reluctantly abandoned years ago by its residents who once fought so hard to keep the dam from being built. When the water comes, only the old church towers will be visible above the lake, rising like gravestones in the valley. But to the surprise of many, new Etah City and its citizens are doing quite well.
It was only natural that the people initially had a negative attitude toward the construction of this dam. Once we moved into our new town, we were happy. It is much better than our old town.
The protests forced the government to learn as much about community development as it did about building dams.
When we had to relocate the town of Etah, we hired architects and engineers to help us solve the problems facing the community. It was also important to take advantage of certain old architectural elements that are relevant to their culture. So we put the stained glass windows from the old church into the new church. And I think the people of the community feel they got something that was fair.
In the old town, most of the young people were leaving. Now, with a vibrant new community and the dam promising jobs and greater economic opportunities, the younger generation is staying. And the older generation has adjusted just fine. At Etah, the Brazilians have shown that there is a way to balance the demand for more dams with the needs of people displaced by them. And there are ongoing attempts to make dams more accommodating to the natural world as well. But it seems unlikely that dams will ever be completely benign to the environment.
I would say that next to nuclear power, dams are the biggest Faustian bargain that mankind has struck with nature. They've allowed us to settle places that couldn't be settled otherwise. They've created an astounding amount of wealth, of economic wealth. On the other hand, they've had terrible environmental impacts, especially those built on coastal salmon rivers. So we're trying to cope with the environmental effects of dams, and it's a much greater challenge really dealing with the consequences than it was building the dams.
Water and power are critical to the existence of society, And for centuries, dams have been a key provider of these essentials. But if their price to the environment ultimately proves too great, these may one day be the last of their kind. Giant signposts to a world that use dams for the advancement of all civilizations.
An army attacks. Explosions rock the earth. And lives are threatened. But this is no war. It's a tunnel. Join author-illustrator David Macaulay for a journey into tunnels next time on Building Big. Building Big continues at PBS Online. Meet engineers, explore big structures near you, and experiment in a virtual lab at pbs.org. Next on Nova. 230 feet down at the bottom of the sea, the battleship that changed naval warfare forever is in danger.
I'm starting to run out of time.
Dive into an adventure to save Lincoln's secret weapon. The season premiere on Nova, mind-altering TV. The 5-part Building Big boxed set and the companion book by David Macaulay are available from WGBH Boston Video. To place an order, please call 1-800-255-9424. Educators, ask about our Building Big curriculum kit. Major funding for Building Big is provided by the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. Funding is also provided by
You'd be surprised how much of our technology goes into your day. We're Siemens.
The American Society of Civil Engineers, working to build you a better world since 1852. The National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding our understanding of the world. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.